Your chameleon needs a cage that's big enough to hold the right temperature and humidity gradients, as well as provide for their sense of security. It is a space in which we need to create an environment that will enrich them and allow them to take care of themselves.
Welcome to the Panther Chameleon Podcast. My name is Bill Strand, and I will be your guide through the life stages of the incredible Panther chameleon.
One of the first things you need to think about when you're getting a new chameleon is what cage you're going to keep the chameleon in. But there are so many different choices for chameleon cages out there, and more are coming online all the time. Today, we're going to go over how to evaluate the features of a cage to decide if they are right for your chameleon. Now, I know it would be much simpler if I just gave you a cage and said, this is the one for you. And actually, I would probably be doing you a disservice, because everyone needs different features in a chameleon cage depending upon where they live and what the environment around the cage will be. So I'm going to explain which features are important and why they are important, so you are able to make an educated choice as to which cage to get for your chameleon. To start off with, I want to lay down the groundwork of what a cage is. I know the first thing that comes to mind is that a cage is meant to keep a chameleon in so it doesn't get out of the cage. It doesn't crawl all over the house and get in trouble. And so it's very common to think of a cage as something that confines a chameleon. But this mindset really doesn't work for us. We don't want to just get a chameleon and wrap a cage around it. What we are looking for is that a cage is something that is the borders of this sanctuary that we are creating for our chameleon. We are creating an entire environment within the cage that will nurture our chameleon and give our chameleon choices between temperatures and humidities and security gradients so they can take care of themselves. When we have the mindset that a cage is just to contain the chameleon, our recommended cages tend to get smaller and smaller and smaller. But when we have the mindset that we want to build an environment for our chameleon and enrich our chameleon, the cage recommendations tend to get larger and larger. If you are putting together your first chameleon cage, you're often not aware of the consequences of the decisions you make. And when someone tells you to get this minimum size cage, you say, why would I get anything bigger? So hopefully through this podcast, I explain the consequences of making all the different decisions. And so you can get the cage that will make you and your chameleon the happiest. That said, it's time to get into some specifics, and I'm going to go over the most commonly asked questions when it comes to chameleon cages. And I want to give you a full answer so you understand why. So one of the first things that people ask when coming to chameleons is, can I keep chameleons together? We as humans, we know the greatest joy is when we find someone to pair up with and have our mate forever. And so it seems cruel to not give our chameleon a friend. Well, chameleons are not like us. They are actually solitary animals. And in fact, keeping them together will cause stress, eventually cause sickness, and even death. But then you say, but wait, I see pictures of chameleons together. I see chameleons together at a show, at the pet store, and my breeder said he keeps chameleons together. Well, the problem is that this is a slow process. Cohabitation, which is keeping chameleons together, produces a chronic stress, which is a stress that is constant over long periods of time. And so the effects of that stress build up. That's why you can take a snapshot of two chameleons in a cage and they look fine. But 6 months later, one of the chameleons has died. Even though we humans so want to pair up chameleons, the fact is chameleons don't want to be paired up. The hard, fast rule that we all need to follow is that it's one chameleon per cage, no exceptions. So do not worry about your chameleon being lonely. They will be very happy in a nice big cage on their own. So what size is best for a chameleon? The answer to this question is that the bigger the better. And this is because when we're trying to create an environment within the cage, it's actually us that needs that extra area in the cage so we can give them heat gradients, UVB gradients, humidity gradients. But in hard, fast numbers, the generally accepted minimum cage size for your typical chameleon species, Panther chameleons, veiled Jacksons, is the 2 foot by 2 foot by 4 foot tall cage. Over the last couple decades, this size has shown that it is suitable for growing healthy chameleons. The commonly seen 36-inch by 18-inch by 36-inch tall is also suitable. But I have to say, if you have the opportunity to get a cage that's larger than these minimum dimensions, take it. Even extending the cage width from 24 inches to 30 inches makes a world of difference for your panther chameleon. Going to 36 inches is even better, and 48 inches is even better than that. Now you'll notice I talked about width more than height, and we're going to be talking about that next. But the point of this particular section is to say, get the biggest cage available. When you hear minimum cage sizes, that's just what they are. The minimum. These have worked before, but if you can go bigger, do it. So let's pick up on what we just touched on. Width versus height. Which is more important to a chameleon? And the reasonable answer is that both are important. But the important concept that we want to learn from this is that chameleons are actually horizontal animals. They like to go back and forth, not necessarily up and down. Yes, they are arboreal. Yes, they like to be high up. But if you had to choose between a tall cage and a wide cage, I would rather have a wide cage placed high up on a dresser than a tall cage placed on the floor. You see, what's really important is how high their basking branch is relative to the height of our head. Chameleons get security from being high up. They don't necessarily care how far below them their cage floor is. They care how far below them your head is, and the heads of your cats and dogs and other animals. Chameleons will be much more secure and much more happy if they're perching above your head height. So what about the females? People involved with panther chameleons notice very quickly that females are smaller than the males. I've often said that females can be in the 18 by 18 by 36 inch tall cage, while the males need the 2 by 2 by 4 foot tall cage. But this is a perfect example of how if you have the chance to go bigger, do it. The reason why so many panther chameleon males get in the 2 by 2 by 4 foot tall cage is because there aren't a whole lot of options above that cage size. Now, we're working on changing that, but right now it's not as easy as saying, I'm just going to get the next cage size up. With female panther chameleons, yes, you can keep them in the 18 by 18 by 36 inch tall cage, but it's very easy to just go to the 2 by 2 by 4 foot tall cage. And this gives you more room to create an environment for your female panther chameleon. So they are smaller. Yes, you can get away with having them in a smaller cage, but I encourage you to get the 2 by 2 by 4 foot tall cage or the 36 inch by 18 by 36 inch cage. And if you can go to the larger cage sizes, please do so. So many of the recommendations that are floating around in the community come from a breeder or collector mindset, which is how many chameleons can I stuff inside the room that I have? And honestly, we have to change that. That is not the mindset that will increase the amount of joy you get from keeping chameleons. The joy that we get from keeping chameleons is having a beautiful lizard in a lush environment. The larger the cage, the happier you are going to be with your chameleon keeping experience. But what about a juvenile? When I get a 3-month-old panther from a breeder, the little thing, should I start them in a smaller cage? And the answer is no, because when you get a chameleon from a breeder, if they're old enough to be sold to you, they are old enough to go into an adult-sized cage. Chameleons grow quickly. And really, by the time a panther chameleon is 3 to 4 months old, they are ready to take on the world. Yeah, they're smaller. They don't look as intimidating as an adult panther chameleon, but they're well enough started in the world that they're going to do just fine in a Madagascar-sized cage. Don't worry, you are not going to lose your 3-month-old panther chameleon in a 2 by 2 by 4 foot tall cage. You will notice that they will use every bit of the space you give them, and there really is no reason to buy a smaller cage to start them off with. But you say, what if I get an egg and I hatch out a chameleon? Well, in that case, I am going to say that it is worth getting a smaller cage. A single hatchling chameleon would do good in a 16 by 16 by 30 inch tall cage. This provides enough space for you to create an environment, but not so much that it's going to be hard to find your chameleon. And at this age, especially if you don't have a whole lot of experience, it's a good idea to be able to keep track of that hatchling chameleon. And to be clear, your hatchling chameleon will do just fine in a densely planted adult-sized cage. I mean, that's what they're designed to do. And I've done that a number of times, and it's a lot of fun. But there are days that go by that I don't see my chameleon. Yes, I water, I put food in there, and I trust that that chameleon's taking care of themselves, which, by the way, they always are, and they always do, and they always grow up to be beautiful adults. But that's an experience that I would save until you are a little bit more experienced. If you're just starting off, get a 16 by 16 by 30 inch tall cage, and that'll be a great size to start them off till about they're 3 to 4 months old, and then put them into their adult size cage. Now, a caution. We're not going to go into this right now, but be very careful that you don't apply an adult size heat lamp and an adult amount of UVB to a smaller cage. You have to scale everything down. So be careful about general advice that you find on the internet or even on my podcast. Unless specifically indicated, the general advice that comes out is for adults in adult size cages.
Now, if you've been in the chameleon community for any length of time, I'm sure you will hear that screen cages are best for chameleons. In fact, you'll hear that anything other than a screen cage will kill your chameleon. This, unfortunately, is not true at all. In fact, screen cages are usually not the best choice for a chameleon. They are adequate and they can be made to work. But if you understand the characteristics of a chameleon cage, you'll realize that screen cages are usually not the best choice for chameleons. So let's get into it. When it comes to materials for chameleon cages, screen, hybrid, meaning PVC plastic usually, or even glass, all have uses in keeping chameleons. The more ventilation, which means screen sides, that a cage has, the more the chameleon will be living in the same environment as the room you have the cage in. The more solid side you put on the cage and more insulation, the more you're going to be able to change the environment within the cage to be different than the outside environment. And so, for example, if you're living in Madagascar and you have a cage in your backyard, you definitely want a screen cage. But if you live in a dry environment or any environment that you have central air conditioning or heating, you're going to want to have a hybrid cage that will have enough solid sides around it that it holds in the humidity. And then if your room is dry and cold, you're going to want a cage that has some insulation to it and can retain heat, and that would be glass. So as you can see, all of these cages have applications depending upon what kind of room you're putting the cage into. Now, I have to address so many people saying that chameleons need screen cages. This comes from a time decades ago when we were just starting out and figuring out how to take care of chameleons back in the 80s. And yes, I was there. Back then, we wanted to keep every reptile in an aquarium. That's just what we did. And so we started off keeping chameleons in aquariums, and it didn't work so well. We found sudden success when we put them into screen cages. And so, when compared to an aquarium, a screen cage was so much better. And it didn't hurt that some of the most prominent chameleon people of the time were living in Southern California, which is often a wonderful environment for chameleons. I can keep many species of chameleons outdoor year-round. So yes, using a screen cage is very good for someone like me. But for the chameleons that I have indoors, it's a little bit too dry because of the central air. And for my friends that live in the northern latitudes, a screen cage would be ridiculous. And so this idea that chameleons only can be in screen cages comes from a historical situation that isn't applicable to most of the people who are keeping chameleons right now. But it persists because screen cages can be adequate, and there's things you can do to screen cages to make them better for your environment. One example is if you do need more humidity, you block off the sides with a shower curtain or coroplast or window insulation. And so you end up creating a hybrid cage. And if you're a little bit nervous about believing me, because so many people still say chameleons need to be in screen cages, I invite you to take a look at Europe. During all this time when the people in Southern California, including me, were discovering screen cages, most people in Europe were using solid side cages. They've been doing that for decades, so this isn't a new idea. Although, to be fair, there is a different kind of husbandry that you need to apply to a hybrid or glass cage. And most of the people that you talk to online only have experience with screen cages. So you need to be careful that you understand the context and their world of understanding before you apply it to a different situation. There are enough people using hybrid cages out there that you're going to be able to find people that know how to use them. But just make sure you don't use screen cage husbandry on a hybrid or glass cage. And just so you can watch out for it, the differences are mainly in heat retention and humidity retention. With the screen cage, you can have your heat lamp on all day and it's no problem. But if you have that heat lamp on a hybrid or a glass cage, that heat is stored in the cage. And so you need to pay attention to how much heat is going into the cage. And it's the same with humidity. The solid sides hold in the humidity, and so you don't want to overdo it. And as for me, I use a combination of both screen cages and hybrid cages and a little bit of glass. So I have experience in all three. I know how to use all three, and that is what I teach from. Now, one of the concerns about glass cages or acrylic front doors is that the chameleon will see its reflection and be stressed out. There are times and there are conditions where a chameleon will see their reflection. But in the vast majority of cases, this isn't a problem. Yes, they may react when they first see this ghost chameleon, but chameleons figure out very soon that this ghost chameleon isn't invading their territory. And this does have a parallel, because chameleons do see each other in the wild. But as long as each chameleon stays on their own bush, there doesn't need to be a fight. And even breeders have noticed this. If you have male panther chameleons who are very territorial, and you have them in a room and they're facing each other, it won't be long before they all settle in and they're okay with chameleons on the other side of the room. Sometimes they'll flare at each other. They'll just flash some colors to say, hey, I'm a big man here on my bush. But there really isn't a fight because there is no invasion of territory. This will change if you take, say, a mirror and you put a mirror inside their cage. Okay, you're going to get a reaction to that. Now, there are ways of reducing the reflection. One, have overhead lights as close to the front of the cage as possible, say if you have an acrylic or glass door. The further the lights are from the glass, the more the angle produces a reflection. And then if the room is dark but the cage is lit up, then you'll see a reflection. And so you want to have the outside room lighter than the inside of the cage. And then, as I said, eventually the chameleon gets used to having the ghost chameleon on the other side, comfortable knowing that that chameleon is not coming into their territory. Now, with all of this, many of you are excited about making your own chameleon cage. And for that, I encourage you to do so. But it's best to do so for the right reasons. If you think it'd be a lot of fun to make a chameleon cage, that's a good reason. If making a chameleon cage allows you to use more of the space you have available to you, that is a great reason to make your own chameleon cage. If you're making your chameleon cage because you want to save money, be careful with that. Generally speaking, I use the rule that if I'm making a cage that's bigger than what's commercially available, then that's worth it. If I'm trying to make a 2 by 2 by 4 foot tall cage, it's more expensive to make the cage than to buy one. Unless you have all the tools already, all the materials already, and you're not taking into account all the excess material that you didn't use. But if you're doing it for fun, for the pride of using something you've made with your own hands, 2 thumbs up, do it. And actually, making your own chameleon cage is a very good way of getting up to speed as to what's important in a chameleon cage when you buy one. And I can tell you stories of the chameleon cages that I have made and the incredible educational experience that it was. But now I only make cages that are bigger than what I can buy. You, of course, know your situation the best, and so you can make the decision that suits you. So we've talked about the features at a high level. Let's go ahead and do a shopping scenario. When you shop for a chameleon cage, you need to consider a number of parameters. And when you're just starting out, it is a little bit difficult to say what you need in a cage. And then when you go online, you find an enormous number of choices to go through. And yes, you'll probably go online because the retail stores generally don't carry cage sizes appropriate for chameleons, even though they have chameleons on the box. If they're not the larger sizes that we've been talking about, they're not appropriate for chameleons. So you do have to be careful about deceptive marketing. But of course, you go online and there's so many options on there. And I will say that the standard cage sizes are around 2 by 2 by 4 foot tall. And as a cage manufacturer myself, my company is the Dragon Strand Chameleon Caging Company, I can tell you that that's not just price gouging. It may not be intuitive, but when you jump from a 2 by 2 by 4 foot to a 4 by 2 by 4 foot, it's not an easy jump as far as manufacturing, materials, and shipping. So here are some things to consider. First of all, the cage type. We talked about screen versus hybrid versus glass cages. And so the question you need to ask yourself is, what is the room that I'm going to have the chameleon in like? This is important. You don't take the weather data from outside. A number of Florida keepers live in a hot, humid environment when you go outside, but inside, when you have the air conditioning running, the humidity goes down. So your chameleon, at least, is not in that humid environment that the weather app says you are in. But let's get real as far as the materials. You have the screen cages that are all screen. You're going to get the 100%, essentially 100% ventilation. When you add one solid side, this does almost nothing as far as ventilation. The two notable companies that do this are, number one, Dragon Strand, my company. My screen cages, I have a PVC piece so the back is solid. And the reason for this is that it blocks the mist from going through the cage and hitting the wall behind it. So it's designed to protect your walls and furniture. ZoomEd has some designs where the front is acrylic, but the rest of the cage is screen. This is done more of a visual thing, so you can look through the clear door and not have to look through screen. Once again, this has absolutely no effect on the ventilation, because even if you have it up against the wall, you still have the complete sides and top that are screened. So if it's in back like the Dragon Strand, it's meant to protect the walls, and if it's in front, it's for your visual convenience. Now, when you have a hybrid cage that has the sides in back that are PVC plastic and the front is screen, you've blocked ventilation a little bit, but only so much that it's going to hold humidity for a little while. The main benefit of 3 solid sides and a screen front and top is that now you're free to point your misters in many different directions, and you're not going to get mist going through the cage, through the back, or through the sides, and so you protect the walls and furniture. With a totally screened front, you still have a lot of ventilation, and so if you want to create humidity pockets, you need to clump together live plants in the cage against the solid walls. And then finally, you get to the true hybrid cage, and that's where the sides and back are PVC plastic and the front is generally acrylic, but there are vents below the door that allow the air to come in down at the bottom front, and the top is screen. What this does is it creates the chimney effect, where the cool air comes in through the bottom, and then the warm air under the lights is rising, because that's what warm air does, and it pulls the cool air from the bottom, and you get this air cycle going on. That's the air exchange that the chameleons need. You do not want to get a hybrid cage or a glass cage if you do not have the vents at the bottom front and the screen top. That chimney effect setup is what makes hybrid and glass cages work for chameleons. That is what we were missing decades ago, where the mantra started that glass cages will kill chameleons. See, we've learned. Now, I do want to say that there are ways of taking one of those cheap screen cages and turning them into a hybrid cage. And so if you already have your cage, you went by the recommendations of whoever you're talking to, they said chameleons can only be in screen cages, but now you're finding that you need a way to be able to increase the humidity. You can turn a cheap screen cage into a hybrid cage by putting shower curtains or coroplast or something on the sides so it holds in the humidity. I personally like using shrink fit window insulation, and you can see that on my website. Now, the feature that I think is the most important to consider before you buy a cage is, where does the water go? The drainage. When you're keeping a chameleon, you most likely are going to have misters and foggers, and so there's going to be water coming from the top, and it goes through the cage, and it goes out the bottom. So the question is, where is that bottom of the cage? Where does all that water go to? And there are a number of ways that cages deal with this. The problem is that a lot of cage designs were not really designed with the chameleon keeper in mind. They were designed for someone who doesn't know what to look for. So first, I'll tell you what I do with my Dragon Strand company, and then we can compare what other companies do. And we do it that way because Dragon Strand is the only company that specifically designed the products for what chameleon keepers need. I'm a chameleon keeper. I designed it for what I need, not to reach a price point that would go good at retail. So that's why there's differences. So the floor of my cage is a PVC piece of plastic, and it lays on top of a bottom frame. But it's not watertight, and so the water will seep out and get out of the cage. All of my cages come with drainage trays, and these are trays that sit under the cage. The entire cage sits on top of the drainage tray. That way, the water seeps through into the drainage tray and physically separates the chameleon from the drain water. And the reason why we do this is because the chameleons poop, and that poop is on the floor. Feeder insects escape and they crawl across the floor. We do not want wastewater, poop, and escaped feeder insects to mix together in an unholy, unhygienic poop soup that the chameleon would eat if it zapped that cricket. And it's important for me to explain that because so many of the other companies have what's called a substrate tray. The difference between a substrate tray and a drainage tray is a drainage tray goes under the cage. The substrate tray goes inside the cage. It's called a substrate tray because you put dirt and stuff in it if you want to have a dirt bottom to your cage. But for us chameleon keepers, that doesn't work so well because that substrate tray catches the wastewater, holds it, collects the poop, allows the escaped feeder insects to run around, and it creates that unsanitary condition that we chameleon keepers are trying to avoid. Zoomed, Exoterra, they have substrate trays. Now, it isn't the end of the world if you have one of those cages or if you want to use one of those cages. All you have to do is get another tray that was meant for something else. It doesn't matter as long as it will hold water. And then you can put the cage in that tray. In fact, if you go on to ChameleonAcademy.com, I have a number of build guides that show you exactly how to do this. You drill holes in the substrate tray that's in the cage, and it all drains out into the drainage tray, and it works. Now, when you start going into other manufacturers, you're going to find bottoms that are either watertight or you're not able to access the bottom because they don't have a flip-up service door. And the thing is, if you don't know to look for this, you'll find yourself with a cage and you're not sure what to do with the water. That's why I'm saying let's think about it before you buy the cage. It doesn't mean that every cage has to have a sophisticated drainage solution, but it does mean that you need to plan for whatever you need to do so when the cage does come, you can set it up correctly. And for the cages that have solid bottoms, this is kind of a problem because putting down paper towels or puppy pads or other things to soak up the water, unfortunately, that still keeps the water and the moisture inside the cage to where it can become a bacterial mess. So I would encourage you not to consider that your solution. Next is, how do you mount branches or potted plants? Since this was a huge issue with us in the chameleon world, I actually invented and patented a product called the Dragon Ledges, which is a retrofit kit for the common screen cages. And what it does is it gives you anchors that go at the level that you need the branches and the pots, and it allows you to create a floating garden style cage. Now, the Dragon Strand cages come standard with these, and you can buy retrofit kits if you get other screen cages. Now, if you decide, I don't want to pay the money for that, well, the trick is that you need to attach your branches and pots and whatever you have to the frame, not the screen. Don't put weight on the screen because the screen rips. It wasn't designed to be weight bearing. So you need something that is anchored to the frame, and then you can attach to whatever branch or whatever you have anchored to the frame. Or by the Dragon Ledges, that's what they were designed to do. And finally, consider the hardware. This is latches, hinges, the screen, and this is actually going to be difficult if you're doing it online because what you're looking for is, number one, how good the latches are, And number 2, are there any rusting parts? And you won't know that until you run a magnet across all these pieces and see where the magnet sticks. Now, this is more important for those of us who use our cages outdoors. We want to know if there's going to be rusting parts. I use my cages outdoors all year round. In fact, I have some cages that I've been using for the last 10 years outdoors. And so for me, having stainless steel and aluminum and things that don't rust is very important. That's why Dragon Strand cages don't have any rusting parts. If you're only keeping your chameleon indoors, which most of you are only keeping your chameleon indoors, it's not a big deal. Even if they do rust, it'll take a year or 2 before you start seeing rust. The place where it's going to affect you the most if you're indoors is these places that use the screen metal, which is just painted over, and they're not using aluminum screen. The screen can rust because of all the misting and such that goes on inside of our chameleon cage. This was a big problem with the major manufacturers, but they got enough complaining, so they have switched over to aluminum. But with all the different manufacturers coming out of the corners, and the propensity for offshore manufacturers to switch out materials between runs, depending upon which is cheaper, you may want to run a magnet over your cage screen just to verify that it is aluminum and it's not going to rust out on you. And so there is your crash course on shopping for a chameleon cage. I know there's a lot to learn, but rest assured most people don't get anywhere near this amount of information about chameleon cages before they start. They buy whatever they were told to get, and then they figure it out from there. So yes, you are getting a step up, but if you end up with a cage that isn't ideal, it's not a big deal. It's easy to work through. So catch as much as you can, do as much research as you can, but like I said, don't worry. You'll figure it out along the way. And of course, you've got another ace in the hole. Not only are you listening to this podcast, have access to the ChameleonAcademy.com, I also do 2 live sessions a week that you can come ask your questions and get answers in real time. I go live on the Chameleon Academy Instagram account on Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Pacific, and then I go on the YouTube Chameleon Academy account on Saturdays at noon Pacific. These are fully interactive, so you can come and ask your questions. Now, you may be saying, wait a minute, Instagram, YouTube, website, you got so much going on, and it's true. I've got a whole lot going on. Sometimes it's hard for me to keep track of what's going on. And so if you want to know everything that's going on in the Chameleon Academy, the best thing to do is to sign up for the email newsletter. That's where I put everything that's going on, all of the outreaches, and so you will know what's available to you. You can sign up for the newsletter by either going to the website and signing in on the pop-up, or else going to the menu item that says newsletter. And then you're on the list, it's free, and you'll get all sorts of chameleon information, and you'll know what's going on. I want to thank you for being here. I am hoping that you're feeling like you're getting a head start in how to take care of your chameleon, and you're going to be well prepared when that chameleon comes home to you. My name is Bill Strand. This is the Panther Chameleon Podcast, and I'll see you next time.